Well, good morning. Good morning. This is truly gratifying when you get a standing room only and have to bring in chairs on the second day of a symposium when it's going to snow and it's already started to sleet. And I want to thank you all for being here. We have been sort of working through the evening and early this morning trying to figure out what to do. And one of the fears I had was that nobody would show up, but that's obviously not the case. We have a couple of announcements before we start with the formal program. We are going to continue today with the program, and as you can imagine, there are some changes. But immediately, and I'll say this again after Secretary Kendall speaks, but immediately following this will be what we had scheduled as the ship affordability panel. We're still going to do that. It's just that the people on the podium will change. We had some people who couldn't make it in, and some people who but got called away on travel. But we still will continue, and I think it's going to be a great panel. Following that, there was supposed to be a point-counterpoint panel that everyone always looks forward to, that the MMA sponsors and that the ASNE people are invited to attend. Unfortunately, that one is canceled. None of those people are able to make it in. But what we're going to do in lieu of that is we at ASNE, and I'm sure MMA has been going through the same thing, we have been wrestling with how to continue as a professional society given the new realities of the way that the government looks at organizations like us and how they define who can participate and at what level they can participate. And so we after 125 years, we're restructuring our business plan, and what we're going to talk about in lieu of the point-counterpoint panel, Tony Lingridge, who was the head of our long-range planning committee, and his committee are going to talk about the plan that they've laid out for us that just came out. It was just briefed out to the sections committee. Hello, Jack.
We haven't had a chance to talk about this. We're punting. This is the punt formation.
Okay.
We're prepared to go ahead with the point-counterpoint.
Oh, okay.
Since we don't have a moderator and we don't have the Navy, it's going to be a point panel. So the industry reps on the panel will come up here. We have the questions that the Navy was going to ask of industry, and so they will address that.
Okay. All right. Change of plan.
Stay here just as if the point-counterpoint were going to go on.
Perfect, Jack. Did everyone hear that? Probably not. Belay my last. The point-counterpoint panel will proceed, and it'll be a lot of fun. We have the industry guys, and we have hand puppets. No, we're gonna continue. We're gonna continue with the point-counterpoint panel, and I think it'll be a lot of fun. So anyway, we'll go on with that the way it was scheduled. And now one commercial. I did this with the students yesterday. I want to do it with you. In 1888, the naval engineers and naval constructors who created the American Society of Naval Engineers saw the need for two things that were essential for them to do their jobs correctly. Number one was a means to capture and disseminate the lessons learned that they each were experiencing as they tried to recapitalize the fleet at that time. And the second one was a forum whereby they could meet face to face and develop the relationships that they saw as necessary to help them be able to effectively do their job and to further their careers. And that's why the American Society of Naval Engineers was created, to carry on those functions. And we still do that today. That's a primary focus that we have. The question that I often get, or a lot of us get, when we ask people to join and become members is, what's in it for me? At first glance, that question is hard to answer. But in reality, what's in it for a person joining any professional society is exactly the answer to those two questions of why the society was created. And so it becomes easy to answer. And so without a vibrant and contributing membership, things like this, and the Fleet Maintenance Symposium, and the intelligent ships, and the other opportunities where we have together won't happen. So what I'm asking each of you, if you're not a member, please join. If you are a member, rustle up somebody who's not and ask them to join, because it's going to take all of us doing that to keep this organization running and to keep these kind of symposia, the Naval Engineering Journal, and all of the continuing education program, all the other things that we're doing to keep that running. So let's all be evangelists and get out there and do that. Thank you. Thanks. Want to thank the American Bureau of Shipping for the coffee and the continental breakfast this morning. We all needed it. And we wrapped up yesterday on a great note. We had an honors gala last night where we honored 7 people with awards, and it went off really well, and the desserts were great, and I'm sorry if you missed it, so be here next year. It's a good way to wind down the evening. A lot of smiles and a lot of handshakes. We also yesterday had the student poster competition, and I want to announce the winners of the student poster competition. The first place in the graduate category went to Miss Rebecca Hattery from Old Dominion University. Second place winner in the graduate category went to the University of Michigan students Ryan Caverly, James Forbes, Dennis Bernstein, and Yinlu Young. The second place winner in the another second place, it was a tie. Second place winner in the graduate category went to Villanova University students Anderson Labad, Edward Zhu, Dylan DeGatano, and C. Nataraj. Sempriti Bhattacharya, Annie Mazumdar, and Harry Asada from MIT received third place in the graduate category. For the undergraduate student posters, the first place went to Denny Farrar, Alfred Hammett, Joshua Micklin, Jonathan Ritchie, and Alexis Thompson. Second place winners in the undergraduate category went to Jared Cartwright, Moody Fahim, Darini Farrar, Sterling Hammett, Matthew Sanders, Stephen Trinner, and Win-Win Zhao from Old Dominion University. And I believe the first place winners were from Villanova, correct? It's not on my notes, but that's okay. And also we had David Capello from Old Dominion University receive third place in the undergraduate category. I think we should give them all a round of applause. We had about 80 students from 16 universities here. Some are still here. Some had to leave because of getting back to Boston before their flights get canceled. We had several hundred 6th through 12th graders here, and that was extremely exciting. And I tell you, going along with the Women in Naval Engineering program, one of the things that warmed my heart was that about 75% of those 6th through 12th graders were girls. And interesting my granddaughters in engineering is a challenge I've undertaken. So I thought that was really wonderful. We'd like to extend a thanks to the Naval Engineering Education Center and to the ASNE flagship section for supporting the student program. Fantastic. Now, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, it is my great privilege to introduce our keynote speaker, Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, the Honorable Frank Kendall. He's responsible to the Secretary of Defense and leads the department's efforts to increase its buying power and streamline the defense acquisition enterprise. Probably one of the toughest jobs these days. Preceding this appointment, he served as Principal Deputy Undersecretary and also as the Acting Undersecretary. Mr. Kendall has over 40 years of experience in engineering management, defense acquisition, and national security affairs in private industry and government. He also served on active duty in the U.S. Army for 10 years. Specifically within government, Mr. Kendall held the position of the Director of Tactical Warfare Programs in the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the position of the Assistant Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Strategic Defense Systems. Spanning the course of his career, Mr. Kendall was awarded several federal, civilian, and military awards, including the Defense Distinguished Civilian Service Medal, Secretary of Defense Meritorious Civilian Service Medal, Presidential Rank Award of Distinguished Executive Senior Executive Service, and Meritorious Service Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Frank Kendall to the podium.
Well, it's great to be with you. I was listening carefully to the introduction, and I will tell you that you got one new recruit for ASNE this morning. When I get back to the office, if the rules allow me to get on my computer and go to your website and join, then I will. If not, I'll have to do that tonight. But my engineering background is generally systems engineering and aeronautical engineering, aerospace engineering. But I'm very much interested in nautical engineering, naval architecture, and naval engineering. So I'm looking forward to learning from some of the resources that I know you have. I want to really emphasize and support what the society is doing. And I would like to have a conversation about the rules and how they're affecting you. I put out a couple of memos that encourage people to have technical conferences and to send government people to technical conferences. We went through, I think, in retrospect at least, an overreaction to some things that happened in the public domain. We have to be very careful about the perceptions we create when we have meetings like this or anything else. But that aside, it's very important for our conversations with each other and for our conversations between industry and government, and also for the development of our young professionals to have conferences that are particularly science and technology-related conferences, but also ones that just foster the relationships between the different parties. I think it's very short-sighted, and I think, frankly, we've overreacted in some cases. We've been, if you will, penny-wise and pound-foolish about that. So I'd be happy to also have a conversation about the impact that's having. How many of you are aware of the memos I put out encouraging people to have, okay, I'm seeing a few hands here, good, good. I've done it twice now, and I'll do it again, and I'll continue to emphasize it with service leadership. What I'd like to do this morning is talk about kind of a list of topics, and then I'm going to spend some time on what we call better buying power. But before I do that, I want to hit a few things that I think are topical and probably important to everybody involved in defense for the United States, one way or another. The first thing I want to mention is our new leadership. Dr. Ash Carter, who I keep trying to remind myself not to call Dr. Carter or Ash, has come on board as the Secretary of Defense. And he's been testifying this week, largely trying to get the message out about the implications of sequestration, which I'll say a word or two about in a minute. Ash is someone I've known since 1980. He was my boss as Undersecretary for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics when I was his principal deputy. Worked with him there for a couple of years, but I've interacted with him and worked with him off and on over the years in a number of different positions. He's got a great background. Technically, he's a nuclear physicist. He's also majored in medieval history, and I love history too, but I'm not quite sure if I would have tried to do that. He's served as an assistant secretary on the policy side of the Pentagon, and he has come back, and he's been Deputy Secretary of Defense, so he's come back into the building more prepared than any other secretary I've ever seen to do the job the day he arrived, and he's demonstrating that very clearly already. The only other person I might put in that category would be Bill Perry, who also had a very strong background before he took over, moved up from Deputy Secretary to Secretary. Ash has articulated his priorities, people first, which you would expect and which is very appropriate, taking care of our people, military people and their families and others involved in the defense enterprise. Assisting the President, supporting the President as he deals with all the real-life problems around the world. And then the last one I would call protecting the future. It's the idea that we've got to keep the Defense Department healthy, not just today and for the operations we're doing right now, but also with the operations we might have to do in the future. And I think that's a very appropriate list. Of those three, I am probably most concerned with the last one. I am concerned with the other two to a certain degree. And we'll be supporting Ash as he hits the ground, as he has hit the ground running. I think there are people in shock in OSD right now about the change in the tenor and the pace at which things are moving. We're still kind of reacting. I was not surprised at all by this. I know Ash very, very well. And I think it's a very healthy thing. We're going to have very strong leadership going forward at the Secretary level, and I think it's great because we need it, because we've got very serious problems that we have to deal with. And I'm going to talk about the first of those right now, which is the budget. We've requested of the Congress about $35 billion more than a sequestration level. That's a big jump from last year and the year before. And it's going to be a hard sell to convince the Congress to do that. Under any circumstances, even if there were no sequestration rule law sitting out there, we'd have a hard time asking for that kind of an increase over the last 2 or 3 years of budget. The last 2 or 3 years have been an anomaly. Starting in 2013, we implemented sequestration. We cut a deal to avoid sequestration in part in 14 and 15. And now we're back facing it again and trying to get back to the level that we always said we needed to defend the country. People have asked me why the president doesn't send a budget over that's at the level the law requires under sequestration. The president's duty is to send a budget over that gives him an adequate resources to secure the United States. That's what he's going to do, and he's going to continue to do that, I think, and I think any president would do that. The problem we have, and I'm going to turn to sequestration now, is that we put in place what turns out in retrospect to have been one of the stupidest laws ever passed. It would have been one thing to put a law in place for 1 year that said that we're going to have mandatory cuts to this level unless something else happens. That was what the intent was. But we put a law in place that is in place for 10 years. 10 years. So we tied our hands. We put handcuffs on our hands, tied them behind our back for 10 years with this law. And for the people in the Congress who care about nothing except reducing the deficit, they have an enormously valuable tool now that they are not going to let go of without one heck of a fight or without a really good reason. We have got to give them that reason. Dr. Carter is trying to do that in his testimony the last 2 days. He's going to continue to try to do that, Secretary Carter. We all have to join in that, I think. I've been very vocal about it. We did not anticipate that sequestration would ever be implemented. Bill Lynn was the Deputy Secretary of Defense when the law was passed. I remember him coming back afterwards and we were sitting in a meeting and he said, you know, the idea of the sequestration thing is that it will cut budgets to such an unacceptable level that we'd have to be absolutely crazy to do this. And we did a really good job of making it so bad that nobody would ever do it. He was wrong about that last part of it. And we went into a series of events. Sequestration was only supposed to last 2 or 3 months. It was only supposed to be on the books for 2 or 3 months. Remember the super committee? Super committee was supposed to get a deal. The Speaker of the House and the President came very, very close to having a deal, and they thought if they kicked it into the super committee, then they would come out with a deal, and they put sequestration in place as sort of a tool, a gimmick, if you will, to try to get them to get to a deal, to give them a reason to say, okay, we got to get to a deal or these really bad things are going to happen. The bad things being arbitrary and deep cuts in both domestic discretionary and defense discretionary. They didn't do the deal. And then through a circumstance of events, we went to a political place where all the Bush tax cuts were expiring and tax increases were forced upon people who really, really didn't want to do that. That left them in a position where the thing they could do to, if you will, balance the books politically, I'll put it that way, I'm not sure anybody else would, was to let sequestration happen. And then it did in 13. Now, we've been saying forever that this was a really devastating thing. I said it in my confirmation hearing. What happened in the result, though, was that sequestration came in not with a big blast, but kind of quietly. It was damage that was distributed all over the department. Everybody took 8% cuts, basically. Readiness was devastated the most because we needed high readiness because of the operations were ongoing. We did a lot of heroic things to try to recover readiness and protect it. We did furloughs for our workforce, and we did damage limitation, got through that. Okay. But what happened politically in that process was sequestration, which had been unacceptable, suddenly looked like it was something that could be done. And if you read articles about it today, what people are saying now is they talk about it just as a cut level that was imposed. They don't talk about it as what it really was, which was an unacceptable level of defense spending that was designed to force people to come to a compromise. Anyway, here we are. We have it now. We've got to deal with it. And I think it's going to be a really tough sell for us to get rid of it. But we need to fight that fight. We need to prevail eventually. What will happen under sequestration? We have to go figure that out. We're working on some things that we would send to the Hill to give them some better information on that so they're better informed and hopefully to help make the case. In the past few years, as we've had to deal with lower budgets, significantly lower than we had asked for except for 15, we have done what I would call damage limitation. We have said, okay, what's the least harm we can do while we wait for the next year and try to get the money back to where it needs to be? So that's the way we proceeded. We did it kind of in the last minute in 14. In 13, we did it under the imposition of sequestration, and in 15, we did it with some degree of planning, but all with the assumption things were going to get better. The budget we've submitted, again, has this very large increase from current levels. And beyond that, we've actually added money. If you look at our budget beyond 16, it's bigger than what we requested in 15. Why is that? Because we need the money. We need it for several things. We need it for the nuclear enterprise. Secretary Hagel commissioned some studies last summer, came back with recommendations that we really need to put $2 or $3 billion a year more into the nuclear enterprise. We did that. We were able to do that because we added $5 or $6 billion a year beyond 16 in the 5-year plan. We needed some money for new technology. I was able to get some prototyping programs, something called the Aerospace Innovation Initiative, about $1 billion there roughly into the budget. We also got, under that same umbrella, new engine technology for the next generation of high-performance engines. We put a few other things in that we're able to afford with that roughly $5 billion a year that we added to our request beyond. There's a big increase in the modernization accounts. If you look at the press accounts, you can see that we're trying to fundamentally recover modernization. When the department looks at its obligations around the world, when it looks at the fights that it's in today or might be in tonight or tomorrow, there are things that we have to do. And when budgets are cut, those tend to get protected. I tend to be, as the Undersecretary for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, the person in the room when we debate budget issues who was most concerned about the Department of Defense we're going to have 5, 10, 15, or 20 years from now. Most of the rest of the people in the room are concerned about the Department of Defense we're going to have tomorrow. And that leads to a kind of an attempt to balance all this out. We do the best we can. We think we've got a viable budget. It's a responsible budget. It supports our strategy. But sequestration is sitting out there. And of course, the horrible thing about sequestration is it's the default position. It requires Congress, to get rid of sequestration, requires Congress to do something. And you can expect that the most likely thing for Congress to do is not to do anything. So that's the situation we've got. And it's also easy for the Congress to just pass bills that are meaningless. We can easily pass an authorization bill, which is consistent with our budget request. In fact, Senator McCain and Reid have written a letter to their budget committee, which I think they released this week, saying they want $577 billion. That's the total national security budget, but it includes DOD and Department of Energy nuclear funding as well, and some other things. But basically, they're asking for more money than we asked for in our budget, by we think about $15 billion. That's where they think we ought to be. And they can get a bill through, perhaps. They can get a National Defense Authorization bill through at that level. But about an appropriations bill, though? Where it really meets the road is with an appropriations bill. And if we don't get an appropriations bill, even if we do, unless we do something about sequestration, we automatically revert to sequestration. So Congress is going to have to act. And it's possible to play let's pretend and just sail on until sequestration hits. That's not a good course for us. I don't know exactly how we're going to deal with this as we work our way through the next several months, as we get into 16, just about 6 months from now. But we got a major problem there. We do everything we can to make the case. And I'm sorry to go on for so long about that, but it's critical to our national security. It's critical to the health of the Defense Department. It's certainly critical to the Navy. Other thing I'll mention in the budget that's looming is the cost of the nuclear deterrent. I gave a testimony yesterday before a subcommittee of the SASC with the other members of the Nuclear Weapons Council, which I chair. And we spent a fair amount of time on the fact that we've got, starting in about 21, a big bill to recapitalize basically the entire strategic deterrent. A higher replacement, obviously, in the Navy would create huge problems for the shipbuilding account. We have the new bomber coming in the Air Force. We have a new cruise missile that we tried to accelerate. And one of the things we did with that additional money we got was to accelerate the long-range standoff weapon, the cruise missile replacement. And we've got a replacement for the Minuteman III we have to do. These are all required. These are not optional programs unless we decide to give up the one leg of the triad, for example. And no one is talking about that seriously at this point. So we've got a problem out there that we're going to have to solve. That's all still within the sequestration window, by the way. So that, if it still exists at that time, is certainly going to compound the problem. The other thing that I'm very concerned about, and it's related to these, and it has a lot to do with better buying power, is technological superiority. I've been giving speeches for years now about my concerns about technological superiority, and it is particularly true of naval assets. One country in particular, but not the only one, is building weapons that are designed to defeat us, in particular to defeat our power projection capabilities, which are very dependent upon naval forces. I'm talking about China, of course. China's building anti-ship cruise and ballistic missiles. They're going to be building them in quantity, and they're building very sophisticated missiles. They're also building wide area surveillance systems, electronic warfare systems, very capable air-to-air systems, missiles, electronic warfare, and they're working on fifth-generation fighters. I've been watching this for 5 years now. I came back into Pentagon in March of 2010, and I started getting my daily intelligence reports, and nothing in the intervening 5 years has made me any less concerned, and I became concerned immediately. And I've been pounding the drum about this for a long time. I've written about it. I've given testimony about it. I've spoken to 4 secretaries of defense about it now. I'm very fortunate with Dr. Carter and with Deputy Secretary Work to have a very sympathetic ear on this. But we still have to meet all of our current requirements around the world. There's no free lunch in our budget. And in sequestration, I'm afraid modernization will be the part of our accounts, the account within the budget, which tends to take the greatest hits. It's just almost forced upon us. So we have a big issue there. I am concerned about the industrial base. I'm kind of giving you my list of problems here. The industrial base is suffering from the drawdown that we're experiencing, and it's suffering from the uncertainty associated with our budgets. Very aware of that. We're watching it closely. We've taken some steps to protect, for example, shipbuilding industrial base in a couple of cases. And we've been looking at this over the last few years. Every year as we go through our budget process, one of the last meetings we have with the Deputy Secretary's budget review group called the DMAG, Deputies Management Action Group, which actually was formed by Dr. Carter when he was Deputy Secretary. One of the last things we do is an industrial base session where we focus on any issues in the industrial base. And we have consistently made some adjustments to try to protect parts of the industrial base there. Our flexibility to do that is limited. We're looking at kind of the big picture end of this. We're also looking at small businesses that have niche capabilities that are very important to us. We try to track those. We need people from industry to bring those to our attention in many cases. Otherwise, we're not aware of them. And we're looking at the health of our design teams. One of the reasons I've been pushing to get prototyping programs into the budget, one of the several reasons, is to preserve some of our design teams. Next, I'm concerned about the acquisition workforce. We've done better recently. In 2013, we had a horrible year, treated our workforce very terribly with furloughs and everything else, government shutdown. We did not send the right message to our people. I had a person who works for me who I won't name, but he's an MIT grad in naval architecture. And he said he always worked for the government and done a lot of really terrific things. And he said to me, you know, for the first time in my career, I'm actually thinking about leaving the government. And it was a result of the way, basically, government employees were being treated. He did not leave. He's a loyal, dedicated person. But also, we got to retain our talent. We got to recruit talent. We need to bring new people in. I'm delighted to see the students here. I mean, this is a terribly important thing to do with your time in your life, okay? If you can defend your country by bringing your technical expertise, your talents as an engineer to the table and helping us build better weapon systems, that is a very noble thing to do. And I really encourage you to continue with that and stay with it, whether it's in government or in industry. We are in a competition for superiority. We've spent about 20 years, 25 years, very complacent about our role. We've taken technological superiority for granted. We can't do that anymore. We should have stopped doing that a long time ago, frankly. And it's engineering, fundamentally, that's going to keep us ahead, engineering and science. Okay, I'm going to talk about better buying power now, and then I'm going to go through some of the bullets that are in the better buying power list of things we're doing. Let me give you a little bit of the history. A lot of you are probably very aware of this. Better buying power started under Secretary Gates. And it started with Secretary Carter, who was Undersecretary for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. He and I, at that time, realized that when Secretary Gates announced that he wanted to have efficiency initiatives in the Department of Defense, that since we were responsible half of the budget, that probably we should do something about that. And what came out of that was better buying power, what we now call 1.0. It was very focused on productivity. It was focused on best business practices, and there was an underlying focus on our cost consciousness. The idea that our workforce in particular had to be very aware of cost, be doing everything it could to reduce costs, and to be more efficient with how it used the taxpayers' money. And it was a set of kind of best practices. It was, you know, these are the things you should do, basically, in order to do this. And that was 1.0. And with any initiative like this, it's not the initiative that matters, it's the follow-up. It's what you do to implement the initiative after you put out, here's the things I want you to do. So we set up a group called the Business Senior Integration Group that Dr. Carter chaired originally, that I supported him on, and that I've been chairing for the last 3.5 years. The Business SIG works implementation, but it also looks for new ideas. It brings new things to the table. It recognizes when things aren't working. It stops them. And it tries to reinforce the things that are good and make sure we're looking at metrics on performance on some of those things so that we're making progress in fact and not just in theory. As we went through that process over the next couple of years after we rolled out 1.0, it was clear to me that there were a lot of other ideas we'd accumulated, and it was also clear to me that we needed to add a couple of things and make some adjustments. So out of that came Better Buying Power 2.0, which rolled out about 2.5 years ago. 2.0 took us in a slightly different direction. the subtext to 2.0 as a guide to help you think. It recognized that our professionals in industry and in government, but primarily in government, have to make thousands of decisions across the Department of Defense, this vast enterprise, every day. And what we really need to do to achieve progress was to help those people make better decisions. Give them the tools they needed, give them some guidance, and empower them to do those things. So 2.0 was much more about empowering our workforce and about helping people think through the problems that they had to solve and give them more tools. It also introduced the whole new category of professionalism and professional development. And the idea there was that we rest on, there were several things buried in that. One is that basically it is a profession to do acquisition. It's actually quite a few professions. You know, it's contracting people, it's engineering people, it's program management people, it's cost estimators, it's testers, it's a lot of different career fields that contribute to acquisition. Each of them has a very specialized body of expertise. Each of them has a necessity for a long period of time of development before you can get to the top of the profession and be in the more senior roles. And they're all very important to the outcomes. There's one of the things that I think we tried to make clear in all the Better Buying Power initiatives is there's no silver bullet here. There never has been, there never will be. To get acquisition right, you have to do a lot of things right. You have to get the requirements right, you get to get the business deal right, you got to get the technology right, you got to do the risk reduction, risk mitigation right, you got to have the right resources, you got to have a reasonable schedule. There's all sorts of things you have to get right. And if you mess up more than one or two of them, you're going to have major, major problems with the program. It's our professionals who ensure all those things happen. It's also our professionals working with the operational communities who set requirements for the things that we build. And that's where the professionalism comes in also. The operational communities need to understand that acquisition is a profession, that is not something that you can do by just throw somebody at the problem and who's a good leader and a good manager and expect a good outcome. There's an acquisition reform movement going on now that, among other things, is suggesting that we should put the service chiefs more in charge of acquisition. I don't think they should be in charge of acquisition. I think they should be involved in acquisition in some very important ways. Setting requirements, making sure a personnel system develops talented people and encourages them to go into acquisition, and also making sure budgets are adequate for programs. What they should not do is direct program structures or assess technical risk and decide how much risk mitigation might be necessary. We've had a lot of disasters that have come from that. There is frustration that it takes us as long as it does to do new products sometimes. I understand that. They got to appreciate that there are things we have to do to get a new product done. And if you try to cut too many corners, take too many chances, what you have is an A-12 or an FCS, Future Combat Systems. That's what you get when you do that. We have to do everything we can to cut cycle time, but we should not be arbitrary and capricious in how we structure programs. And while I'm on this kind of train of thought, I'll share a story I use on this with you. If you had a brain tumor and your brain surgeon came to you and said he was going to put you on the operating table and it would take him 6 hours to do the operation, you would not say to your brain surgeon, I want you to do it in 2 hours. You would not do that, okay? And when a service chief who has no experience in acquisition says that you're going to take 5 years to do a development program, he says, I want you to do it in 3, don't do it. They are not qualified to make that judgment. They need to understand that. Anyway, I got off a little soapbox on that one. So we added professionalism. We added the idea of the tools. That was second 2.0. That was the thrust of 2.0. In 3.0, we're going a slightly different direction. And there's enormous continuity in all these, by the way. The Better Buying Power initiatives have much more in common with each other than they are different. I'm a big believer in continuous improvement as opposed to revolutionary change. But the thing we added in 3.0 was built out of my concerns about technological superiority. And it was we got to get back to thinking more about our products and about the superiority of our products and how we get to superior products. So technical excellence, innovation, and technological superiority are really the heart of what we're trying to do in 3.0. So we continue a lot of the productivity improvements, we continue the professionalism, and we add a focus now on technological superiority and the things that are necessary for that. So that's the idea, and the bumper sticker at the bottom up there pretty well summarizes that. So let me take a few minutes to walk through some of the key things that are on here. Affordable programs. This has been in all the Better Buying Power initiatives. It's the idea that we shouldn't start things we can't afford. Now, as a hedge, and for a variety of other reasons, I am pushing prototyping of new technologies even when we don't necessarily have the money to take them into a system right now and don't foresee we'll have it for the next few years. I think that's smart for several reasons. That's a little different than committing to a program that there's no way you're going to afford it in the future. We've been down that road a number of times. We've wasted a lot of money doing that sort of thing. It's not smart. There are some Navy examples, right? We have a couple of ship classes that we have built very small numbers of ships in. That's not efficient. Okay, I was at the christening of the DDG 1000, which initially I think we were going to build 20 or something. Back in my previous life in the Pentagon, when I was Director of Tactical Warfare Programs, we were doing something called the Seawolf. Okay, it is not efficient to dart a ship class that you're only going to build 2 or 3 or 4 of. It doesn't make much sense in almost any case. So we shouldn't start things we can't afford. We waste money that way. Worst case, of course, is we cancel the program after we spent billions on it, and I mentioned a couple of cases like that earlier. Okay, the next thing is, and by the way, achieving affordable programs, ensuring that we don't start things we can't afford, is not an acquisition system problem. It's not an acquisition community problem. It's a service leadership and programmers problem. The people who decide what to put in their budgets in terms of new starts have got to look at this. And what we require the services to do now, and we've been doing this for some time, is to analyze the future budgets that they expect to have and what they can fit in their various portfolios. Now, the problem we have with shipbuilding, with the Ohio replacement, is a good example of that in a way. We can see that problem coming. We're going to have to solve it. We have no choice because we're going to preserve the nuclear deterrent. The question, we don't know how we're going to do it yet, and there's a team that Bob Work has commissioned to try to figure that out that I'm leading with CAPE. There are a variety of ways we can address that problem. The best way to do it is just add money to our budget. I don't know if that's going to happen. But in any event, we need to analyze our futures. We need to look out about the life cycle of a program, 20, 30, 40 years, and decide what we think will reasonably fit in our portfolio. And if it's pretty clear that something won't fit in our portfolio, don't start it. The criticism I get for doing this is that we don't know what's going to happen in the future. We can't plan that far ahead, so why should we waste our time doing this? And the answer is that I'm not trying to write a plan that I am bound to execute. I'm trying to make a better decision today about what I'm going to start. And the analysis of likely futures allows me to do that. It allows me to make a smarter decision now about what my requirements are and what I should start. We went through this as we went through the littoral combat ship review that Secretary Hagel directed. This is essentially what the Navy did. And we ended up where we did because of the affordability constraints. Everybody would like to have had a much more expensive, full up even a destroyer, say nothing of a frigate, but we can't afford that. And affordability at the end of the day drove the design changes we're putting into the LCS. It was the fundamental consideration. Okay, the next major category is controlling life cycle costs. One of the things that I hope we've done, I believe in the Navy that we have done this very successfully, thanks to Sean Stackley and his leadership team, is the idea of should cost. And the idea that program managers have a requirement, it's a fundamental obligation, to understand their cost structure, to analyze that cost structure, to look for places where they can save money, to set targets for themselves, called should cost targets, and then to go do something to try to achieve those targets. That's the basic idea. It's very simple. Industry does this all the time. They do it routinely. In industry, people are always looking at their cost structure, trying to find efficiencies. The government tends to have a culture where what we're asked to do is spend the money. And we have this obligation rate requirement, right? We're supposed to get the money out the door by certain points in time, or somebody will take it away from us. I have a memo out. How many have seen the memo on obligation rates that I did with the comptroller? Okay, a few hands on that one too. I hope that's being implemented out there. We've got to strike a balance. If we don't need the cash flow, we should use it for something else. If we do need it, we should use it. If we have to take money away from a program that isn't able to execute it efficiently or effectively at the time, we want to make sure that program is protected, that it's made whole in the next year and has adequate resources there so we don't do damage in that process. That's the commitment we've made. That's what Mike McCord, the Undersecretary for Comptroller, and I have committed to do together, and I hope that that process is working reasonably well. It needs to be mirrored at other levels. As you go down through the service, you have the same problem within the services, as you're, I think, well aware. Okay, the other thing on here is about intelligence. And it's about emerging and responsive threats. I mentioned at length my technological superiority concerns. We need to get the intelligence community and the requirements community together. So we've added intelligence as well as requirements to cooperation. The Navy does a very good job of this. Sean has something called the Provider Forum, I think, which basically brings requirements and intelligence and acquisition all together routinely, more than configuration steering boards once a year might do, to adjust requirements as necessary and to ensure that we're building the right product that we're going to need in the future. We need to strengthen that. We need to pay more attention to what the threat's doing and what the threat is likely to do in response to what we do. Productivity in industry and government is about aligning profit with profitability. We've been under some concern from industry, I guess I'll say, from day one on better buying power, that we were just trying to cut profit as a way to cut cost. That has never been the case. This has always been about aligning profitability with performance, and getting better performance should reap better returns. Poorer performance should not. And that's the way we should structure our business deals. That's a perfectly reasonable thing for us to do. On the aggregate, I think industry is making reasonable margins, and I watch that. It hasn't really changed fundamentally over the years. There are cases where people make quite big margins, and there are cases where they don't make money at all. But on the aggregate, people have done reasonable. For the business that we're in, and I won't go into length about this, I think you get a reasonable return as a defense contractor. And we want to continue that. We want a healthy industrial base that supports us, so we want to pay reasonable profits. But we want to get something for our money. And we're happy to pay larger profits if we get more for our money. That's the way it works. That's the basic incentive system that we have with industry. We are a number of things on here where we're looking at where we spend R&D money. If we're going to have technical excellence and technological superiority, we have to spend our R&D money effectively. I'm very concerned about the structure of the budget in this category. We have a lot more money now going into upgrades than we have historically. Money has gravitated very much into the upgrade category of R&D, 6.7. We have protected the fundamental research, the science and technology elements of the R&D budget very well. With some direction from the White House, and I think because it's smart, we've kept those accounts at about $10, $11 billion a year pretty consistently. It's the money that's for the new products in our pipeline that I'm most concerned about, and that's where we've seen a precipitous drop, 6.4 and 6.5 accounts. I'm worried about that. I'm worried about having adequate products in the pipeline. I think that's a bad leading indicator of where we're going. So we try to do better there. But we need to get as much as we can out of all of our R&D accounts. Whether it's contracted R&D, whether it's IRAD R&D, whether it's money we spend through the laboratories or any other thing that we do. We need to get as much for that money as we can. So I've got teams looking at each of these areas now, trying to come up with solid recommendations to get more out of each of these investments. And it's not about cutting them, it's about getting more out of them. Innovation, the best innovation for industry obviously is profit motive, and I talked about that already. But there are a couple of other things we can do in here. I want to encourage industry to innovate technically, which means you got to give them a reason to do that. All right? So one thing we can do is we can pay them to do prototyping programs. And I mentioned the Aerospace Innovation Initiative is a program which will lead to X-plane-like prototypes in the next several years. That'll be the basis for what will be sixth-generation air dominance capability. That's one thing we're doing in the budget. And right now I can't afford a sixth-generation aircraft in the budget, but I can get ready for it. I can reduce the lead time. I can keep the technology moving forward. I can preserve the design teams that we're going to have when we're ready to do that. And I'll do that for relatively low cost compared to a full-up program. So that's the idea. And we'll be doing, one of the things I'll be instituting is reviewing of prototyping programs around the department going forward. We're also, and I should have mentioned this earlier, doing a long-range R&D planning activity. The department's chief system engineer, Steve Welby, is leading that. It's part of a broader umbrella of work that Secretary of Work has commissioned. Secretary Hagel actually announced this, but it's really Secretary of Work's initiative called the Defense Innovation Initiative. And the long-range R&D planning effort is part of that. I should have mentioned that earlier. Another thing we're trying to do is, and I can't hit all of this, but I'll hit a few high points. Best value. We have a long tradition in the department of putting out requirements that have objective levels and threshold levels. And then basically what we do is we ignore the objective levels and we buy the threshold levels. Industry knows that very well, and so when industry bids, they tend to bid at the threshold levels because the threshold levels are always cheaper, and bidding cheaper is the way you generally tend to win contracts. We need to give industry a reason to give us better performance. We need to incentivize industry to push the boundaries, to go for more, and to give us that better level of performance. We need it because we're in a competition. So the way you do that is you inform industry of how much you're willing to pay for better performance, and you give credit and source selection for those higher levels of performance. It's pretty basic, okay? Now, we do this as a practical matter to a certain degree anyway when we do a best value source selection. But rather than making it a black box that nobody knows what's going on in, that's done by a source selection authority, it's better to tell industry up front how much we're willing to pay. I often tell the story of experience I had when I was in industry where we had what we thought was absolutely a superior design for a missile. much better engagement envelope, much better probably a kill in individual engagements. And it was above the threshold level. And we couldn't get the service at the time, which was not the Navy. Maybe it was the Navy. It was a joint program. In any event, I tried very hard to convince the department to find a way to give us some credit in the source selection for the higher performance we were offering. I didn't succeed, so we lost on a cost basis. I'm convinced to this day that we had a better product. And now I don't know if we would have been more expensive on just the nature of the design. But I, to this day, don't know if that was a good decision or bad decision by the department. The department never gave itself the chance to think about that and figure that out, which is unfortunate. We don't want to be in that situation. So we need to tell industry, to have well-informed people in industry who know whether it makes sense from a business perspective for them to offer us higher performance or not. We started down this road with the tanker program. We've done it in a few other programs. I don't know if I have any Navy examples right off the top of my head where we've done it in Navy, because I don't have that many new starts in the Navy right now. But we're going to be doing this in general. Unproductive processes and bureaucracy, I'm always trying to get rid of unproductive overhead. I find that it's a great struggle, and after 5 years of doing it again, I'm still got a long way to go. Staffs have a tendency to generate products and may or may not add value. And we have teams looking at that again. I've called on our program executive officers and program managers to come help me with this, because they're the victims of this in a way. They're the people that have to produce these products. We have made some progress. I sent a legislative initiative to the Hill. And in DoD 5002, our volume that describes the acquisition system, there's an enclosure, I think it's enclosure 1, which has 20 or 30 pages of tables of rules that people have to follow, their compliance requirements. And I looked at this as I was writing 5002, and I said, this is crazy. I mean, we've got to simplify this. So I started an initiative. Timing is everything in this business, and it turns out that Congressman Thornberry, the chairman of the House, is on the same path. So it's really nice to have a congressional committee going in the same direction you're going in. And I think Senator McCain's very interested in acquisition reform, and his staff is as well. So we've sent some initiatives up the Hill, which we think will cut substantially that list of compliance requirements down and simplify things for our program managers. It's not a revolution, but it's a start, and it's going to be helpful. We're looking for other things to do along the same lines. We're also looking at the FAR. There's a team looking at the DFAR and the FAR to see if we can simplify some things there and relieve some burden. Katrina McFarland, my Assistant Secretary for Acquisition, has a team that's working with industry on some of the things we impose on industry, some of the reporting requirements and so on. I didn't mention it, but the Superior Supplier Program, which was piloted by the Navy, is another place where we're looking at ways to remove some of the overhead. Reward our better performers by giving them less scrutiny and less auditing, for example, less intense auditing. So there are a number of things we can do. We're going to keep that fight up. Competition, it's the most effective way to reduce cost. We should do as much of it as any way that we can. And when we can't do actual competition, we should have what I call a competitive environment for industry. Interestingly, an example out of the Air Force is their space launch capability. The mere threat of SpaceX forced dramatic price reductions from their competitor. It doesn't take actual competition to drive costs down. People can see the competition coming, they anticipate it, and they react ahead of time. So starting the prototyping program, even if you don't know if you can afford the follow-on system, will have an impact on the current suppliers. They will try to sharpen their pencils and do a better job for you because they can see the competition coming. Open systems is another way to do it, of course. We continue to stress that. I won't dwell on services. My deputy has the lead for me on this, Alan Estevez. We're making good progress on services. We've been organizing ourselves to tackle this problem. We have leaders now for each of the major categories of service acquisition, whether it's facilities support or maintenance or IT or knowledge-based services of various types. And we're trying to identify best practices in each of those areas. I have a draft manual, which is a counterpart to 5002 now for services acquisition. We're trying to strengthen our ability to write good requirements and do good business deals for services. So there's a lot of effort going on there. I think it's still our greatest area for potential savings. We spend more actually now on services than we do on products. It's a large part of our budget, and it really is deserving of our attention. The money is diffuse in a great many contracts of a great many different types, so it makes it a harder problem to tackle, but we've got to do better there. And then lastly, professionalism. We're going to continue to emphasize this. And I am not in any way trying to say we're not professional. We're very professional, but every one of us can do better. Every one of us can learn every day and become better at what we do. And I mentioned earlier why I think it's very important for the other communities we work with to appreciate the fact that we are a profession, a basket of professions in a way, which is important to success. And fostering those communities, helping them grow is critically important. The last item on my list is STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, education. And it's on here because it's so important to the country as well as to the department. Our economic future as well as our national security future, and the two, of course, are inextricably tied together, depends to a large extent on our ability to be creative and innovative and develop technologies and put them into products that not only make us safer and more secure, but also improve people's lives. And I think the most important decision I ever made professionally, I made when I was in junior high school. And I was in honors classes, and I had a choice between I had to neck down. They wouldn't let me stay in honors everything. I couldn't do medieval history and physics at the same time. It's a joke on Dr. Carter. So I had to pick. And I liked English. I liked to read. I liked history. I loved history. I loved math. I liked science. So I picked math and science. It is the most important professional decision I've ever made. We need to get young people to make that decision. And that's when we have to capture them. We have to capture their interest, have to excite them with what the work does that they might be able to do and the things they can contribute to society. And we need to draw them not just into science and engineering, but in many cases into our world. So I applaud what this organization does to foster that. I think it's a terrific thing, and I'm looking for ways to help you. So thank you. I'm going to stop there and try to take a couple questions. Thank you.
Good morning, Secretary Kendall. Chris Barrett with Delta Resources. Thanks very much for your comments. There's just a tremendous amount of information and insight, and the questions can probably be endless, but I'll focus on two. First, fairly simple, with regard to sequestration, what do you see as the possibility for gaining some of the flexibility that you're looking for as to applying the cuts as opposed to just across the board, dumb cuts?
I believe that I may be wrong about this, and I was going to send a note to Mike McCord this morning just to confirm it. Came up yesterday in another context. I believe that the only year under the law that established sequestration in which we had no flexibility in how we took the cuts was FY13. And that year we were required to cut everything the same. And my understanding was that that was the only year in which we had that. Now, what mechanism we have to do other things, I'm not sure. I believe that we go from a line item basis at least to an account basis. So shipbuilding, for example, is an account in the budget. But I'm going to confirm that and see. I think we do have some latitude within some constraints to make changes. The other thing I'm worried about happening as we go through the political process in the next year or so is that we might be in a CR for a year. A CR puts us at almost exactly the same level as sequestration. And that's just the way the numbers work out. The default position that might happen to us is a CR for a year, which means we can't do new starts. There's some real limitations under a CR, but it's a way to kind of keep us at the same level without having to actually pass other than the minimal amount of legislation. So I think if we get deadlocked, rather than shut the government down again, we could easily see a year-long CR. I'm not predicting that. I'm just saying it's one of the outcomes we might have to worry about. Most people are predicting some kind of a deal. I hope that that's the case, and I hope it's very close to the budget that we requested. But we'll have to see how it plays out. We're not that far. We're only 6 months away from starting 16, so that process is well underway now. We've got the opening skirmishes, if you will, and the hearings that are going on right now. I know, I understand, I don't know this, but I understand it, and I believe it may be true, that the HAC Defense Subcommittee plans to mark to the sequestration level. The Senate, I'm sure, the authorizers, I don't think, at least I know on the Senate side, they don't plan to do that. I don't know what the SAC plans to do, or the other committees. I'm really interested in seeing what the HAC-D does with a mark at that level. It's going to force them to confront some things that I think they may not be very happy about having to confront. But in any event, we'll see how it all plays out. I don't know, but I think it's going to be a very, very tough several months ahead of us.
Second part of a question, if I could, more philosophical. it seems to me that we've kind of been lulled into this acceptance, we, the citizenry, the federal government, military, so on and so forth, of inverting national priorities such that those things that are mandated in the Constitution we have termed discretionary, and those things not mandated in the Constitution we term non-discretionary, and obviously that wreaks havoc, particularly on defense. Can you comment on that and the possibility or what we can do to reinvert that?
Interesting way to look at it. I don't know that I'd look at it in those terms, constitutional terms, but I do think we should look at it from the point of view of where is the deficit problem. The deficit problem is not in defense. It's not in domestic discretionary. It's in what we call the entitlement accounts. That's where the growth in the deficit is coming from. It's largely medical costs, to some degree it's Social Security. These tend to be political third rails. But with our polarized politics right now, getting the legislature, getting to a deal on those things that really addresses the deficit growth problem is really problematic. But what the Congress tends to do is to avoid those and to focus on the discretionary accounts. You know, they together constitute about 40% of the budget, the federal budget, and they're not growing that much. The growth is all in the other accounts that I mentioned. The other scary thing in the budget is interest. Interest rates have been historically lower, much lower than they have been. Interest rates recently have been much lower than they have been historically. If we see a return of inflation and interest rates start to go up, the interest rate, because of the size of the overall national debt and the way we finance it, that part of the budget is going to balloon, and it can balloon very quickly. And that's going to create a real crisis for us, I'm afraid. I don't anticipate that. I'm not an economist. I'm an engineer. But it's a worrisome part of the equation.
Sure. Tony Lingerich, CACI. I was really impressed with the theme that goes behind your Better Buying Power initiatives. I had never put that together before. So if you look to the future, the next 4.0, any thoughts on where you want to go next?
I don't know. I don't think that far ahead, frankly. I got an enormous amount of work to do implementing 3.0. We've got a draft implementing instruction for 3.0 that I'm going to be working on over the weekend. It's not where I need it to be yet. I have had to push back. The way we do these is we roll them out in draft. What you saw was labeled draft. And we give industry and people in government a chance to give us comments and give us ideas. We put teams together to go work what we would actually do under these and to see if we want to make any changes or not. I'm probably going to make a couple of changes. I'm going to add a cybersecurity bullet to this, for example. And we're going to combine a couple of things. And I've got a document which is, I think, too long right now, which is the implementing instructions. But after we go through that 3 or 4 month process, then we roll out the implementing instructions, and then we're focused on what are we going to actually do about these things. So we're not quite there yet. I'll be putting that out sometime, I hope, by the end of this month. It was going to be next week, but we're not ready. 4.0, when I did 2.0, I didn't know there was going to be a 3.0. I thought there might be. I think the whole idea of continuous improvement is that you're always looking for new ideas, and circumstances change. So as circumstances have changed and new ideas have come out of the table, and we've tried things, and some of them worked, some of them didn't. It took us a long time to get the Superior Supplier Program established, for example. We had to work through a lot of bureaucratic issues with that, administrative issues. So we're going to continue to evolve, and I expect to be around for a couple more years, so in a couple of years or a year and a half or so, we'll take a look at where we are and think about what might need to be done next. But it's too early for me to talk about 4.0 yet. Okay, thanks very much. Enjoy being with you.